So hello, and from the European Research Council in Brussels, and welcome to this webinar on the new ERC Work Programme for 2026, which was published 2 days ago on the 8th of July. The Work Programme sets out details of the current and upcoming ERC grant competitions with full information on the call timetables, the budgets, the evaluation procedures and so on. My name is Martin Penny and I'm the Head of Communication at the ERC. And with me this afternoon are my colleagues Angela Liberatori, the Head of the Scientific Department, and Alban Kellerbauer, the new Head of the unit supporting the ERC Scientific Council. Angela and Alban will tell us what's new and important in the work programme for 2026 and the upcoming grant competitions. This will actually be the last appearance of Angela in one of our webinars, as she'll retire from the ERC at the end of the month. So Angela, we wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you.
Today's webinar is designed especially for researchers who are new to the ERC and its funding opportunities. So if you're already familiar with the ERC, you can join us for a more advanced session on the 11th of September. Of course, if you're already here and you want to, you're more than welcome to participate in today's session as well. We're pleased to see that so many of you connected. Before we start, please note that the questions and answers in YouTube is deactivated and that we'll be using Slido, and the code will remain the same through the whole duration of the webinar, and you can see the code now on your screens. Now, we've introduced ourselves, but it's always good to know a little bit more about our audience who's joining us this afternoon. So we'll start off the webinar with 3 questions to you. To reply, you can use the Slido hashtag ERC 2026, or the QR code that you see on your screens. The questions are all simple. So firstly, let's find out where you're connecting from. So you should see the question on the screen right now. Find out where we're connecting from. You can see people are starting to respond. So 6 responses. They're going up. People from France, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from the Czechia, from Switzerland. Some giving names of cities, so some from Brussels. From Norway, from the Netherlands, from Ireland, from Croatia, from Turkey, from Lithuania, from Greece, from Denmark, some in languages from Deutschland, some joining us from the United States, from Cyprus, Limerick, also from Poland, Lithuania, Norway. Numbers are still going up. We have 432 responses. But we see that Europe is extremely well represented, and we have we have people coming from all across the world to the webinar. So we will move to the second question, and for this we'd like to know what your job position is. And again, if you go onto Slido, you'll see the options which we're putting forward. So you're responding a lot quicker on this one. So already 205 responses, 250 responses. The vast majority of your researchers, many postdocs, some university administrative staff, some working in other positions, I guess policy advisors and so on. But the vast majority of people are researchers. We're up to over 550 responses, 600 responses. So vast majority of researchers, PhD students and postdocs. And of course, this webinar is very much directed for you as well. So I'll move to the last question, which is just as simple. And it's whether you've applied or whether you're planning to apply for an ERC grant. And again, you'll see the options on the screen right now. Give you some time to respond. Almost 200 of you responding right now. And we have the audience we hoped for this webinar, that many of you have not applied, but you're planning to apply. So almost 400 responses now. Some of you have applied, haven't received a grant yet. A small number of you, congratulations, you've applied and you're successful, and I guess you're looking to apply again. But the vast majority of people here today haven't applied and you're planning to apply. So thank you very much. I think that gave us an idea of who's here today and how we tailor the remarks that we make, and also predict some of the questions that we may get from some of you. So After some introductory speeches from Angela and Alban, the rest of this webinar will be dedicated to answering any questions you may have. I'd encourage you to already start asking those questions. You can do so on Slido, or to like or endorse questions for others. We will address the top-ranked questions first. And just some housekeeping rules for your questions in Slido. We'll try and answer all of them live, but if by the end of the webinar we don't have time to answer all of your questions, we'll respond to them in writing afterwards and then publish them on our website. On YouTube, you can enable the live subtitles in English as a visual aid, and you can also find in the description box a link to the different types of grants the ERC offers, as well as other useful information. So enough of my introduction. We'll now move to the 2026 work programme, and I'll start off with a question to Angela. Angela, what are the changes and the novelties in the 2026 work programme that you'd like to highlight?
Well, Martin and all of you, there are 5 main novelties that I think are worth stressing. One is about the new proposal structure. As you know, it's always in 2 parts. Now it will be, first of all, shorter. The first part of the scientific proposal will be 5 pages, and what it is about, the main research question, the main objectives, and research strategy of the proposal. The second part will be more about the implementation. For example, and very strongly, the methodology to be used, but also justification of the resources requested. There will be still, obviously, the CV and track record. As you might remember from last year, the proposal has more weight, but the CV and track record definitely remain. And this is for 4 pages. It includes the achievements, the scientific outputs. Outputs are not only publications,
Sure.
but also other contextual elements like career breaks or other career paths. There is also an annex about the grant you already got, and this is mainly to know about your track record and to avoid, for example, double funding. There is a second element of innovation, which is about the evaluation, and this is also related to the way the application is made in part 1 and part 2. The main change is that the issue of feasibility is not going to be addressed in the first step of the evaluation, but in the second one. So the first step of the evaluation really will be about the research objective, the research question, how you explain and how you convince the panel member that there is some frontier of knowledge that you are really pushing. And it's very important that this is addressed. Okay. While in the second step, the implementation will be addressed, particularly the methodology, the resources to be committed, and, for example, in the Synergy Grant, how the combination by the different PIs is going to be addressed. A third element of novelty is that, as you know, there are a number of eligibility extensions. Life is very different, so we want to try to have a level playing field taking in account this diversity. So the 2 new extensions, one is semi-new, meaning it was there but not so explicit. That is, in addition to maternity and paternity leave, we are explicitly mentioning parental leave.
Okay.
The other one is really new, and it's about victims of violence, gender-based violence, but also victims of other forms of violence on the basis of skin color or anything else. For all those, there must be some kind of documentation and an interruption of research work for at least 90 days. Fourth change, additional finding, big simplification. Instead of having subcategories, we have one big thing that says additional funding, to be clarified what it is for. And as you will notice, additional funding is 1 million for a number of things, field work, experimental work, infrastructure access, and so on. There is also 1 additional million for relocation and startup cost for people coming from outside Europe and the countries associated to the framework program.
So 2 million in that case.
So 2 millions in that case.
Thank you.
1 normal million plus the 1 more million for that.
Thank you, Angela.
And submission restriction is the last one I will mention. And this is mainly, well, in fact, it's only about synergy In 2016, applicants who got a B at step 2, will not be eligible for application in 2026. It's a bit draconian, but it's a matter of trying to control the number of applications.
Okay.
It's a very successful call, so we need to limit a little bit.
Thank you, Angela, for that overview of the novelties in the work programme for this year. I turn to Alban. So Alban, the Scientific Council has announced their intention to change the eligibility windows for starting grant and consolidated grant in 2027. So this is for the future, it's not for the current work programme. But can you tell us more about these changes and why the Scientific Council has decided to make them?
Sure. So as you already said, these are changes that are planned for the 2027 calls. So I would like to emphasize that they will only become confirmed once the work program has been adopted approximately a year from now, the work program 2027. So there will be a few changes to the more junior grants, the starting grant and the consolidated grant. First of all, the eligibility periods will be extended from 0 to 10 years for the starting grant and from 5 to 15 years for the consolidated grant.
Okay.
So this creates a substantial overlap of 5 years between the two, which is intended. And it's meant to give researchers the ability to choose the path that is most appropriate for their career stage. And the rationale for this change is that researchers reach independence or consolidate their careers at different stages in different disciplines. And the Scientific Council wanted to introduce more flexibility in order to cater to a variety of career paths. The rules for extensions to these eligibility periods remain the same. The resubmission restrictions will be confirmed later and will be published with the Work Programme 2027. So secondly, another change is that from 2027 on, only one starting grant and one consolidated grant can be awarded during a researcher's career. However, it is still possible to apply for and obtain several advanced or synergy grants.
Okay, so it's not a restriction on the numbers of applications, but on the number of grants which can be held. Okay, thank you, very clear, Alban. Angela, if I can turn to you to a final question. Earlier this year, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in a speech in the Sorbonne, made an announcement about a new grant that will be offered by the ERC, as she termed it then a super grant. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yes, actually, super grant, which is most likely going to be called ERC Plus, will be introduced in Work Programme 26, the one we are presenting today, through an amendment during the autumn, because we are still working on it. So the good news indeed is that there is more budget for this grant, and the Scientific Council agreed about the fact that this will be used for grants for up to 7 years and up to 7 million. Open to all fields of science and also grantees of any cohort, from the junior cohort, our starting grantee cohort, so to say, till the more senior cohort, the advanced grantee kind of cohort. We do not yet have details because we are working it out. The only thing we can already tell our interested applicants is that in terms of calendar, because the amendment can only be processed during the autumn, we will try to follow more or less the calendar of the advanced grants, meaning opening of the ERC Plus call in May, late May, more likely, and closing in September, so that people will have the time to apply, and we also have the time to recruit the panel members.
Okay, very clear. And I think for both of those cases, Angela was talking about the super grants, which will come through an amendment to the current work programme later this year. Alban was talking about changes which may come for next year. You'll hear more about us, and so stay tuned to the ERC different channels, our website, our social media, and this YouTube channel. But now it's time to turn to you and your questions. And so if you haven't already submitted your questions through Slido, please go ahead and do so, and we'll start answering them one by one. So I see, Angela, the first question is really for you, because it's a follow-up of one of the things that you were talking about, looking at the recommended structure of Part B1 and Part B2, wanting to know what is the recommended structure after the changes? How is it different?
Well, the main difference really is that anything which is about pure implementation, including methodology, work plan, and resources, really is for Part 2. And
Okay.
in part B1, the part 1 of the proposal is really about the idea, the novelty of the idea, where you push the frontier of science, the research question the state of knowledge in your field, why you're advancing it, and the objectives you have. So the idea really is part 1, focus on the idea you're submitting. Part 2, focus on the implementation of how you're going to implement the idea.
And I think it's always useful to remind people how they submit. Part B1 and Part B2 are submitted together. It's not that it's a two-stage application. Everything is submitted at the one time. You submit your Part B1 and Part B2 together.
And also, maybe to be clarified, this is in fact, it's helpful to submit everything together, because it's not that the first part is a summary of the second part. In fact, you should try not to repeat things,
Indeed.
but really to focus idea implementation in a complementary way.
Very clear. Thanks very much, Angela. And then, because the next question is also a follow-up to that in a way, Angela, maybe I come to you for that too. What details should the overall research strategy list in the new part, in the Part B1, in the new Part 1?
Again, of course, it depends on the research field and the research idea. So the research strategy is really why you want to pursue a certain kind of research, giving some ideas about knowing your path, but without going in details of specific aspects of methodology, or some people are using, for example, work packages. We don't ask for work packages, nor milestones, nor deliverables. So the kind of things which are really how to do things are really for Part B2. In the Part B1, the strategy is really about, if I have this question, what I think is the strategy to reach that question.
Okay, very clear. Albin, I'll turn to you for the next question, which is looking at the normal progression of a career. People have carried out their postdocs and now looking to start out their independent research. So the question is, how much of an overlap is allowed between the proposed project, for example, a starting grant, and the previous research people may have done at a postdoc or a PhD?
I would say that typically an application for an ERC grant should be a logical progression in terms of research of what a person has done before, the research work they have carried out either in the course of a PhD or a postdoc, or even later career stages, of course. You should not, of course, apply for funding for things you've already done.
Indeed.
And maybe also preempting already one of the other questions that I'm seeing, it should, of course, be groundbreaking. And this implies that it's not, there's no overlap with what has been done before, with what you have done before.
That's right. So it can be that you're working in the same broader area, but it's a new idea, something which is taking forward the state of the art, pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. Yeah. And I think those 29 of you who have asked the question in terms of the importance of the groundbreaking character of the proposal, Angela, is there anything else you want to say on that, or do you think we've answered that question enough already?
I think that there was at a certain point a bit of a concern in some parts of the scientific community about ERC abandoning the risk-taking approach when it was decided to take away this high risk, high gain, because people were having really headaches during panels about how you gauge the proportionality or balance between high risk, high gain. With some people saying, well, if it is high gain and low risk, what's the problem with that? So the point was made to avoid this kind of reasoning. But of course, the idea is when you push the frontier of knowledge, by definition, you are taking some risks because you don't know at the beginning what you reach and whether you have to change course or whatever happens. So the notion really about groundbreaking is also about taking some risks, of course, risks that you reflect upon in the way you want to approach your research plan.
Okay, thank you. Then I'm just going to move to the next question, which actually moved up slightly in the list. But what are the most important things to make a starting proposal successful? Who would like to start? Maybe Angela, I hear you wanting to start. Go ahead.
Well, for a starting grant, I think you will need to show that this is, of course, a novel idea, that you are on top of the state of knowledge or state of the art, as is often made, and you know how you are going to contribute in advancing it and not just repeating yourself. And also, of course, for a starting grantee, one doesn't assume you already reached independence, but you should show that you started your path towards independence, for example, by having some scientific outputs, publications, or others without your PhD supervisor. So those are the main elements, I would say, that are important for a starting grant.
Thank you. And I think it's always worth emphasising, because one of the things we hear time and time again is how important is your host institution. And let me underline that the host institution is not an evaluation criterion. It's not considered at all in the evaluation. And actually for starting grant, a good number of starting researchers change their host institution in between the time when they've been told they've been successful and actually start doing their research. So the next question's on fieldwork. Does the ERC fund fieldwork in non-European countries? And can some of the funds flow to additional non-European institutions who are integral to the project? I see Angela nodding. Yes, the answer is yes to both of those questions. But I don't know if you want to say some more in that respect, Angela.
I think we can keep it simple and short. Yes. It's really part of the research design to decide where you need to do the field work and how to do the field work. And of course, if you have partners in other countries, they can become third-party beneficiaries or other ways, depending on what is suitable for the research. And anyhow, if there are issues about the form of eligibility of certain institutions' participation, this is something which is addressed during granting to make sure that everything is fine. But yes, we do have a lot of past and ongoing grants with fieldwork outside the European Union and countries associated to the Framework Research Programme. Absolutely.
And just one thing which I think is always worth pointing out about that, one of the criteria that we have for ERC grants is you need to spend 50% of your time in Europe. But of course, if your field work, which is integral to the project, you imagine you're working in the Antarctic or you're working in a telescope in Chile, when it's fieldwork related to the project, that's counted as time in Europe, irrespective of where that fieldwork is taking place. So, Albert, maybe I can turn to you, which the next question is regarding the track record in ERC funding. How important is that? For example, if you imagine you're a starting grantee or applying for a starting grant and you have not received any awarded grants previously, they ask, is this a deal breaker?
I would say it's definitely not a deal breaker, and certainly you don't have to have had a previous ERC grant, because that's not even possible in principle. But it's of course a plus if you have received other grants before, other important grants, but it's not a deal breaker.
Indeed. And Angela, you were talking before about the types of things which they're looking, the evaluators look for, which show the track record. Perhaps you can expand a little bit more on some of those.
Well, track record is really about what you achieved in your career up to that point. Of course, everybody knows it's different if you are a starting grantee, a consolidator, or a more senior scientist. And this can be research outputs in the form of publications. Publications can be articles, can also be monographs, for example, in social sciences and humanities. Can also be other kind of outputs, such as exhibitions or archaeological excavations. Sure. So this is why it mentions outputs, not only publications, and also why we insist that we are not after high impact factors. It was never the case, but it has been made very explicitly. We have also, and the idea is to explain, for example, up to 10 of those outputs, to explain what you think is most significant and why. Then there are the so-called context elements of contribution to the research community. Maybe you have been active in developing a hugely important database in your scientific community, or developing certain research infrastructure which are a service for the community. And this is also considered part of the context of your, if you like, broader citizen science kind of achievement in terms of service to the community. So they are not directly evaluated, but they are seen as part of the context in your track record.
Andrew, a lot of the questions, as you can imagine, are on the evaluation process. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn to you again, rather than the policy, the side of things, and apologies for that. But the next question is, you've got through step one. How are the external reviewers selected once a proposal has been past step one and is going to step two? How are the external reviewers, the remote reviewers, as we often call them in-house, how are they selected?
Well, they are set. So as you know, our panel members are identified by our scientific council. But the remote reviewers are identified by our panel members because they evaluate the proposal, they promote to step 2, some proposals, not others. And then because they act as generalist, I should always insist, generalist doesn't mean the layperson on the street, but it means somebody who is in the field of the panel, but they cannot be specialist in each and all the proposals submitted. So they look for peers who are the specialists on that particular kind of work and field of science. We actually, in order to have a minimum of 3, we actually normally invited at least 15, which also means that sometimes we are lucky and we get 8 or 9 saying yes, another time we have to invite them twice in order to get to 3. So the remote reviewers are the ones who are, let's say, the specialist contribution to the evaluation. They are only participating remotely, which means that then the panel members at step 2 consider that contribution. They are strongly invited to consider that contribution very, very seriously, even if the people are not in the room. And they do so, and very often, for example, they use questions or comments by the remote reviewers for the interview to the applicants at step 2.
And you said if they are selected to step 2, they get the grade to go to step 2. Is there a limit on the number of proposals which can go to step 2?
Yes. It used to be based on the so-called budget multiplier. Depending on the application received by each panel, there would be a budget allocated, and the notion was up to 3 times the overall budget requested and available can be sent to interviews, so that 1/3 would be then selected. But this means that this is some of the large panels, and we have some of what we nicknamed super panels, especially in the physical sciences and engineering field and the social sciences and humanities, but also in life sciences, particularly LS7. We were getting some panels sending, over 50 or close to 60 interviews, and there the point becomes that the quality of the interview and the process could be hampered, and surely the workload was becoming very, very strong for the panel members, plus the timing, interviews at 8 in the morning or 8 in the evening for applicants. So the council decided a cap of 44. It's not a Kabbalah number, it's basically counting 11 interviews per day, plus the fact that in the first day there is a briefing and calibration, and in the last day there are all the panel comments that need to be drafted as a feedback to applicants. So this is why now there are 44 maximum interviews at step 2.
Thank you, Angela. Very clear, and just so that, again, one of the things which people often ask a question about is the success rates amongst panels. So just to underline that the success rate is equal in all of the panels. You should choose the panel which is most closely aligned to the most exciting part of your research. And as Angela says, the number of interviews in step 2 is optimized so that both the candidates and also the panel members can carry those out in the best conditions possible. So Angela, it's another question for you. Should the preliminary work be summarized in one of the parts? Now we have this part 1 and part B2. When we're looking at preliminary work which may have been carried out, which gives an idea of the research question and how it's going to be put in place, where should that be summarized?
Well, I guess if it is about how from the previous work you find another question that was not addressed in the previous work and a new objective that was not covered in the previous work, then you will put that in part B1. If the point is, I used this methodology in the past and I will use it again now for whatever reason, or I used this methodology in the past, but now I think I need to use a new methodology as compared to my previous work, then you put that mainly in part B2.
Okay, I see the difference. And I think just to continue on this theme, there's the next question, again, is some clarification on this restructuring of the proposal, the part 1 and the part 2. And so the question is, should part 2 purely continue from part 1 so that the content, for example, the project objectives, is not repeated in part B2?
Well, again, we are trying to find general rules, but of course each case needs to be addressed, meaning if you explain how you use a certain methodology, you will have most of the time to say this methodology is to reach that objective without explaining again why this objective, why it links to certain question and so on, simply to explain what is the link between the methodology you use or the resources you want to use and that particular objective, but without repeating everything. The idea, as I said initially, is to try really to focus idea and implementation, part B1, part B2.
Thank you. Just to reassure you, I see there's 111 questions which have been submitted, and we will, 112 now as I speak, but we'll get through as many as we can, and we will answer any ones which are not answered live, we'll answer them in writing. Alban, I'll come to you. A question, if you receive an A grade, but the proposal's not funded, is there a limit on the number of future applications that you can submit in subsequent calls, or is there a limit on when you can submit again?
Not at all. So if you receive an A grade, you can immediately resubmit or at a later time. Very short and easy answer.
Very clear, thank you. And then I may move on to the next question, which is also for you. It's relating to some of the advance information that you gave for the Scientific Council's intention to restructure the eligibility years for starting grant and consolidated grant. The question is, can you provide updated eligibility years? I think perhaps maybe if you can confirm the intention and also the timing when this will be formally confirmed.
Yeah, so I can repeat what I said in the introduction. So the eligibility period for starting grants as of 2027 will be extended from 0 to 10 years, and for consolidator grants from 5 to 15.
Okay.
And this will be for 2027 and confirmed with the new work program 2027, which is expected to be adopted in a year from now.
Okay, so this is all the future plans.
Yeah.
The current plans are the current eligibility windows that we have, so 2 to 7, 7 to 12, 2 to 7 for starting grant, 7 to 12 for consolidated grant. Then a really interesting question. What's the most common mistakes in V1?
Well, I don't know whether they are most common, but surely some of the mistakes are about not being clear on what is the new research question you're trying to address, or to give the impression or indeed pursue something that for the panel member will look like really incremental work rather than something that break new work. So the point is really to be explicit. Why this research? What is the research question, first of all, and why this is going to lead to new ground, new discoveries, new something. And these are, quite basic things, but sometimes people are not very clear on that. And you also have to think that the panel member, it's a very competitive call. So if you use quite some of the space of a not very long proposal to repeat things or to say things which are quite vague, you are competing with people who are probably quite sharp on what the question is and why, what is expected in terms of novelty, how they build without repeating all the previous knowledge. So that's, I would say, is some of the mistakes, so to say, that we see.
Alban, anything else you'd want to add in terms of common mistakes?
Not to this one, no.
Okay, for me, I would echo what Angela was saying. The whole point of B1 is you want to get the panel members excited to read more. And so you need to put across your groundbreaking idea, why this is exciting, why this is pushing back the frontiers of knowledge, and they want to be able to read more. So make sure, as Angela said, that that's really clear, setting out what the idea is, and get them excited. I would also say, from what I've seen in panels as well, make sure you've looked at the formatting of your proposal well, make sure you've done the spell checks, make sure you've done the grammar checks. Don't overuse bold and underlining so it's really hard to follow. You want the panel members to be able to read it, for it to be a pleasure to read. So make it simple in terms of the structure and make sure your idea shines through. So the next question is on proof of concept. We haven't had a question on proof of concept so far. Very simple question. Are there any changes for proof of concept grants in the Work Programme 2026? We know there's a change in the budget, but is there any more changes in the way the proof of concepts work?
No, the proof of concept will remain the same. By the way, in terms of calendar, they will open in November with two deadlines, one in March and one in September. So it will be quite some time for people to to apply.
And just because I know we saw from the introduction, many of you are new to the ERC. If you're wondering what are we talking about with proof of concept, these are grants which are given to existing ERC grantees, again on a competitive basis through a call for proposals, to take an idea from their research project and look at the feasibility of taking it to a product or a service for the market. So next question, when it comes to team members. Alban, maybe I come to you. Is there a limit on the number of team members?
No, there is not. And I mean, this is a point that is very discipline specific. And therefore, of course, there is no restriction on it. It's up to the applicant to decide the best possible team size for his or her project and to justify that in the application.
Okay, that's very clear. Then next question we have comes back to the additional funding, which you talked about in some of your introductory remarks, Angela. We know that it can be used to cover startup costs. Can you give some examples of what we mean by startup cost?
Well, you are somebody coming to Europe from whatever, US, Japan, South Africa, I don't know, any place in the world. And you need to relocate yourself and your work. Now, you might relocate in a place where, for example, you need certain kind of laboratory equipment and it's already fully available, or you might need that equipment and it's not yet available.
Okay.
So then you need to cover yourself to come and maybe some part of this equipment and maybe also somebody who deals with that equipment. So again, it's quite depending on the field of work and also the kind of relocation that happens, but it's rather flexible.
But just to be clear, it's costs which relate to starting up your grant,
Yes.
not for you personally for
No.
relocation.
No. It's
Okay.
about getting started for your grant. Any of the costs that are eligible for funding need to be related to the implementation of the ERC grant,
Very
not
clear.
about something else.
Very clear. Then we have a question on the CV structure. You know, we have a narrative CV, and they ask what's more appreciated, a small narrative introductory section, then list of achievements and outputs, or putting everything in narrative style. I think this is going to be contextualized and personal choice, and I don't know if there's a right or wrong way, Angela, but I don't know if you have any recommendations or any ideas in terms of things which have worked well.
What clearly works well, again, is clarity, which is also what we said about the scientific proposal. So, for example, as mentioned earlier, in selecting the 10 scientific outputs, the idea is also to give an example of why you think those are particularly meaningful for the proposal you are submitting. So be clear on that. The other thing is that your CV and track record are not only measured in general with regard to the benchmarking toward vis-a-vis your community, whatever that will be, but in relation to the proposal you're submitting to ERC.
Okay.
Which means you should also show why, if, as Alban said earlier, this is a natural progression of your previous work, but not the same previous work, as Alban said, but if it is a natural progression, it comes quite natural to explain why you can do it. But sometimes you might decide to do something which is not directly springing from your previous work, and then you need to explain a bit more why you think you're still able to do the research in this new field, maybe because in the meantime you collaborated with other scientists in that field, maybe you started something. So these, I would say, are the elements to be made very clear.
Very clear. Alban, I'll turn to you for the next questions. We saw when you were filling in the Slido poll earlier, many of you were postdocs. And so the question is really looking at people who are a postdoc and maybe applying for a starting grant. Can you do so if you haven't got a permanent position?
Of course you can.
Great.
In fact, we've heard that the restriction as of now is to have completed the PhD 2 years before, at least, to qualify for applying for a starting grant, or 7 years for a consolidated grant. So that is the only restriction. Otherwise, you can be in any type of employment as a postdoc, as an independent researcher. It doesn't matter.
Okay, very clear. And indeed, many of our starting grantees don't have permanent positions when they apply, and part of the funding which they apply for is their own salary. but we often find when people have been lucky enough to be awarded a grant, then they will find that they are offered also a position and no longer need to draw their salary from the grant, and that can be used to fund other staff on the grant instead. The next question is, but actually the questions orders is changing so rapidly, I'll need to move to a different question. So question really looking at somebody's situation. I haven't won any grants, similar to what we've been asked before, Alban, so I'll come to you. I haven't won any grants. People tell me if I haven't secured funding in the past and don't have publications on the topic that I want to focus on, if they're wanting a change of direction, then I have no chance. Is that true?
I don't think that's the case. I mean, you have to make a compelling case that you are qualified, that you have the tools that it takes to carry out the project that you're proposing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have published in that particular area before. It could help, but it's not an absolute requirement.
And Angela, I remember you said that the focus is given more on the idea than the person. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Well, the idea is that until 25, actually, we had in the evaluation the analysis of the scientific content of the proposal and the analysis of the CV, and the panel members were given a range of marks, 0 to 5, that they can use both for the proposal and for the CV and track record. This somehow meant that implicitly there was an equal weight, because it was the same range, for the two. Actually, over time, the panels were already having a sort of self-regulation, giving more weight to the proposal by looking at the proposal first in their discussion and then the track record, or even going alphabetical to avoid any bias and so on. So then Scientific Council clearly went into, let's be explicit about the fact that what matters really most is the idea. Also to avoid any bias related to reputation. As you said, Martin, the host institution is not an evaluation criteria, partly for a matter of pragmatism, because you can change the host institution,
you can change at any
so
point.
It doesn't matter.
Yes, indeed.
But also to avoid any reputational issue depending on the host institution you were part of at the time of application. And similarly, the point was, even if, of course, there tends to be a correlation between the track record of the person and the successful of a certain work, the point is there can be somebody who is still new in the field, as in the examples we made, but really excellent in pursuing it and really a breakthrough idea. And we want to make sure that the breakthrough idea is the one selected. So this means that now, for example, since 25, the proposal still has also scores in addition to the commentary, the qualitative comments, while the track record and CV only has the qualitative comments.
Very clear, very clear. The next question is actually one for me, perhaps, where it says, most ERC events seem to focus on the individual grants, the starting, consolidator and advanced, and will there be a dedicated information session for Synergy? I think we take your point and it's something we'll look at, but it gives me a good opportunity to talk about the national contact points. Because if you are starting to apply, starting to write your application and need local sources of guidance and help, then the national contact points are the people that are there for you. They are appointed by national governments to be your local source of guidance. There are national contact points for the ERC in every member state, in the countries which are associated to the framework programme, and indeed in many countries around the rest of the world. They will also organise many information sessions and probably be organising some on Synergy. But the point taken, I see there's 31 of you that have liked this, so there's a good degree of interest in having an information session on Synergy, and we'll certainly take that into account. Angela, one of the changes in the work programme, which is clear this year, is in terms of opening up all categories of this additional funding to personal costs. Can you clarify under which circumstances the additional funding can be used for additional costs?
Well, it's again very broad and field dependent. So, for example, I remember when the additional costs were discussed with the various categories at the beginning, one of the big issues was experimental work in life sciences and the use of mice or others. And the question was how to pay for those. But at the same time, the issue of field work, including outside the European Union, from the Arctic to the savannas and the tropical forest, was also mentioned. And certain kind of expenses for field work, including certain equipment, local staff, and so on and so forth, can be part of it. Access to facilities. I mean, if you want to have certain satellite observation, you need to pay and to block the time and so on and so forth. And the same for access to certain large infrastructures. So under additional cost, all this can be covered. Sometimes there were discussion about whether the personnel that makes an infrastructure work or that helps in certain laboratory experiment and so on is covered or not. And now it's clear it is.
Okay, that's very clear. And looking in my own area in physical science and engineering, when you're perhaps building new equipment and you're building it from component parts rather than buying equipment, then of course you need to have the personal costs to be able to build that. But just to be clear, when we're talking about additional funding, this is over and above the standard grant maximum types. So it's not something which is automatic. It's something which you should be applying for only if it's needed to achieve the objectives that you set out in your proposal. So I have a question on references. I think this is probably again for you, Angela. So, and it's particularly looking at how references are managed now in the part 2. So do references first of all count towards the page count? And then are we supposed to include references in part 2, since at the second stage both parts are evaluated together? So do they need to repeat references which are already in part B1?
No, you don't need to repeat, because what happens is that the panel members, of course, get access to part B1 and part, the first part and the second part of the proposal, and so do the remote referees. So if you have something in the part B1, you definitely don't need to use space for the part B2.
Okay, very clear.
And the references, again, sometimes people think longer the list, better it is. But actually, if you quote yourself 15 times, and maybe the big references in the literature once, people will just think, big ego, but maybe not a solid list of references. So do the references again in a way which is convincing and related to the kind of work you want to do.
Can I just follow up on that, because this is actually quite related when people are talking about templates. So is there a template for the application? Is it in Word or is it LaTeX? What are the templates for the applications look like?
LaTeX? No, it exists. So definitely it's quite, there is a limit of words and pages, but we are, the sections more or less to be filled. But again, it's quite flexible.
And I think here that's where your website of choice has to be the funding and tender portal.
Yes.
And there is a link to it in the additional information. If there's not, my colleagues will make sure there's a link to it in the additional information. And that sets out all of the documentation that you need. It's where you can see the application templates. It's actually where you write and you submit your proposal. So everything is there. I'd advise you to check it early. Don't leave it to the last day when you're writing to look at that. It's best to write and draft and plan all of your proposal directly in the software that's used for submitting applications. So Alban, a question for you. If I apply, for example, for a starting grant in 2026, and I get a low score in part B1, so you're only in the first, you don't get through to the second step, can I apply again in starting grant 2027?
So this one I'm going to have to pass to Angela.
Okay. Angela.
So basically, if you are, if you get a C in step 1, the notion is you need to think about it again and rather carefully, so you cannot apply for 2 years.
That's it.
If you get a B, it means, well, there were good things in it, but not good enough to go to step 2. So again, ponder a bit more and come back in 1 year time. And then last year, the council introduced the A non-invited versus the A invited, to say, because sometimes we had long discussion in the panels about, well, this is almost an A, so cannot go to the step 2, but it could come back next year. So this is why the council invented the new category of A not invited, which means they don't go to step 2, but they can resubmit directly in the following year.
Okay. And now I think it was a very closed question. So if I get a low score, can I apply again? I think we gave you a lot of information, but the answer specifically is if you get a B or a C in 2026 in Part B1, you can't apply again in 2027. There are restrictions which Angela set out in her answer. I'm going to skip a question because I will come back to it, but the next question I think is one which many people will be answering. So the ERC Plus, the super grant, they ask, will it be a standalone application open to all stages of researchers? The answer is yes. Angela clarified that in her introductions. Will current applicants be restricted? So all of the details on how you can apply the eligibility conditions are being completely finalised by the Scientific Council. So we're not in a stage to give you the definitive information right now. It's a question we'll need to leave pending, and the Scientific Council intends that the work programme, which we've just adopted, will be updated in the autumn to provide all of these details. So we're not in a position to answer that question right now, but hold this space. We'll give you an answer very soon on it as well. So there's a question which seems to have disappeared, but let me answer it. In terms of the definition of consolidator grants, they say it's a bit nebulous. What kind of track record do you need to have as a consolidator, which makes you different, for example, from a starting grantee?
Well, one of them is just the basic numbers that were reminded by Alban. If you are 7 to 12 years after PhD, including or later if there are extension, then you are defined as consolidating as a researcher. Now, what distinguishes a consolidating researcher from a starting? That's actually something that we see in some communities is not that obvious, so let's try to clarify. As a starting grantee, you're not requested to have already your own lab, your own team. It can be your first project where you lead the team, but you have to demonstrate how to go about it. For a consolidator, the notion is that you have already something, but of course you are still consolidating your path. Therefore, you have already a certain number of outputs. You might have already a team that you are enforcing or that you are changing for something new and so on. So it's really partly factual, how many years after PhD, and partly is about how you explain that for one you're really going to get started and in one consolidating. And maybe this relates to another point that you were making earlier, Martin, that the idea of the starting grants of ERC is really to give a chance for researchers, as Alban was saying, who, for example, do not yet have employment in the university, with the idea that they can choose to stick to research, and in our case also choose to stick to Europe to do research, while in consolidation, the idea is that you are already somebody who has been in research for a while and you want to keep sticking to research in some different ways.
I just want to take a question which is a little lower down, but is so related to that. Is there a minimum H index recommended to submit for COG?
No.
No. I think we can just answer that one with a simple no.
Nor to any other.
Thank you. Thank you. Angela, there's a question which is right up your street, as you're a social scientist by yourself by background. So does the ERC cater for theoretical or desk-based work in the social sciences and humanities?
Absolutely, yes. Actually, part of my background is in philosophy, so that's at least quite much of desk work. But actually, the same applies for theoretical physicists or mathematicians. They can do a lot of desk work, and the same is in the humanities. While historians would go also to archives, so that would be somehow closer to field work in other disciplines. In other cases, theoretical work is really desk work, which doesn't ever mean ivory tower work, because even when we do theoretical work at our desk, we normally interact with other people who might be at the next desk or in another country or over time.
Okay, and there, of course, I think the simplest answer is any area of research. We're completely bottom up, as the expression goes, so you decide on the research question. Now, Angela and Alban, we have 144 questions remaining. We will go through as many as we can. We'll answer questions for about another 15 minutes. So rest assured we will answer as many as we can live, but you'll get answers to any questions that are remaining in writing afterwards. So there's a question on LLMs, large language models. How are proposals with LLMs dealt with? Are there policies and protocols in place to sort this out? I think that's more a question for you, Angela, in terms of the evaluation. But maybe you can...
Okay. Look, this is, of course, a very important question. There is work going on AI in science, including an ongoing consultation and so on. So we are working on it. Now, Alban might recap the scientific council position on this, which is very open, which is you can use whatever helps you to do a stronger and better work, but you are responsible. We have already cases of people who do not pay attention, and then we get a list of references which is clearly related to some kind of hallucinations because they do not exist. Well, in that case, it's the responsibility of the PI. If you use AI and large language models, you better know how you use them and check that you do not leave hallucinations in your application. So this is basically the situation now. The Commission has more guidelines for the time being. Some of them are in progress. Scientific Council might work on this again, but basically what we stick to is if you use them, you are responsible for the way this comes out, and you have your peers who will be able to detect not only hallucination, but also on whether we even made experiment with our scientific officers. And sometimes you see that you can have a very nice summary of the state of the art or the state of knowledge and zero new ideas coming on it. So if you use, the large language model to give you a state of the art, probably you get something relatively sound. But if you ask for the new question, maybe you still need to use your brain. So these are a little bit the situation we have now. And our panel members, as you can imagine, are taking the matter also very seriously. And we also tell them that they can use some elements of AI for example, improving the text, but the prohibition to share confidential knowledge with third parties also applies to artificial intelligence third parties. So if something is in a cloud, in the, outside Europe or elsewhere, that means sharing confidential information with a third party.
And Alban, we know this is something which is changing rapidly, so I'd imagine this is something which the Scientific Council will look at quite frequently and probably come back again.
Indeed, this is frequently discussed in the plenary meetings, and the policies may change in the future, but as Angela presented now is the state as we have it today.
Thank you, and you can find a statement on the Scientific Council's views in that respect on our website. So the question now on collaboration. Again, Angela, perhaps more for you here. How are they evaluated? So are they viewed positively in terms that they enhance the feasibility, or are they viewed that they could be potentially undermining the applicant's research independence? So how do you balance that? Because you can see collaboration as being positive or being negative when it's an individual application.
So this is about individual applications.
It's about individual
applications. It's not about
indeed.
synergies, where of course. So again, it depends. We had cases, for example, where a former supervisor was hidden as team member in a proposal, but with actually a big role. And this was seen as maybe there is not enough independence as compared to what is requested. But we have many proposals where the notion is whether somebody builds on their own background or whether they change, for example, for this proposal as compared to what they did before, where they need the expertise of other team members. It can be a matter of disciplines, can be a matter of methodology, can be a matter of coverage of certain other, for example, countries or elements of an experiment. So again, it depends. If it is explained why it is genuine and useful, then it's a plus. If it is something like, we don't know exactly what this person is doing, but it seems to get a lot of resources to do something not clear for what, then this can be seen as...
So if I understand correctly, I mean, I think what you're saying, Angela, is that these are individual applicants and individual applications, and so the role of the principal investigator needs to be prime. So it needs to be clear that the person that's applying is in charge of the research and using collaborations to enhance their work rather than to substitute their work or work with somebody else where they are actually doing the lion's share of the work. It's really about the principal investigator being prime in the application, using applications, or as the question says, where they enhance the work.
I know there are also different approaches in some research community. In some research community, people think the principal investigator is a primus inter pares, and they want to be rather, how to say, egalitarian and co-producing research in their work. That's also okay if you explain it in that way, but you have to explain why you are the person who is submitting this idea, whether some team members are helping you on only a specific part of the project or whether you want to involve them in the entirety of the project. So I think that's, as you said, Martin.
So there's the next question, Albin, I just want to go down a few questions because again, it's on this changes in the eligibility windows. So there's a question, is it possible to apply for the Consolidator grant this year? And imagine you get an A non-funded. And then if the eligibility windows change, you can apply to starting grant if the eligibility windows have changed and expanded. Is that possible?
That's absolutely the case. So that is a consequence of these changed eligibility periods. Of course, resubmission restrictions may apply.
Of course.
They will be confirmed again in a year's time. But apart from that, as far as the hard numbers are concerned, absolutely.
Okay.
It's the case.
Very clear, and I think it's useful to clarify that. Again, Albin is giving advance information on the intention. These will be confirmed in the work programme, which will be published for 2027, about this time next year. So again, looking at the application procedure, is it true or still true that the ERC discourages applicants from using metrics such as journal impact factors when describing their track record?
Yes.
Very clear. Very clear. I think we can stop because I think that's a very clear answer, and it's a yes-no answer. So a question which I'm not sure the context of this, so maybe we need to think about some scenarios here. Is seniority going to be taken into account, given that most senior researchers may have way more material and track record? So we can take this in two ways. Of course, we have different grant competitions depending on the numbers of years after your PhD. So you're evaluated alongside people that have similar years of experience to yourself. But even within that range, from somebody who's, say, for example, in starting grant, who's 2 years after their PhD, and somebody who's 7 years after their PhD, do the panels take into account that difference that you may have even within a cohort like starting grants? Yeah,
absolutely. And in all cohort, also, in advanced grants, for example, you might have somebody who is, 13 years from PhD and somebody who is 25 years from PhD. Yeah. So in all cohort, there is some kind of assumption. And this is also why, for example, career breaks or unusual career paths as a context are considered, because depending on the career, one might also have a period of not very high scientific productivity because they were doing, I don't know, Médecins Sans Frontières somewhere, sure, or providing a service to the community through, I don't know, building open access repositories somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So this is taken into account. Of course, the notion is also, it's for you to explain, at the best of your capacity, why you think your career track allows you to be able to conduct that research. I should also dispel one consideration. Very often people think that in order to enhance their success rate, they should apply later.
Wait till the end, yeah.
But actually, there is no evidence about success rate increasing apart from the statistical numbers, that because there are more applications at the end, there are high numbers at the end, but this is statistics, it's not success rate or probabilities. So I would say people need really to apply when they think they have the good idea or the excellent breakthrough idea, and when they think they're ready to go for it.
Okay, so the answer, yes, the panel's taken into account the seniority within the eligibility window, and I think you're right. It's always worth underlining that the success rate is very flat across that window, for example, in starting grant or consolidator grant. So coming back to your question about what makes a consolidator, the question is, I still have, and they say, a great collaboration with my former supervisor, I guess PhD supervisor, it's not clear, but also some last author papers. Is this sufficient independence for a consolidator grant?
Look, having collaboration, there are scientific collaboration for life. And of course,
true.
ERC is not going to be against it. Again, the point is this your ideas primarily, and are you the person who will drive, if you like, the implementation of the grant? And then if you do this with your former supervisor, but you in the driving seat, that's one thing. If it seems like you are continuing the work of your supervisor, but putting your name rather than their other name, this is normally spotted in the
But I think
evaluation.
from how they've described the question, it sounds like they probably have enough. If they have last author papers, they probably have, you just need the great idea, like Angela was saying. And then I think it sounds like you're ready to put in a consolidated grant application. The next question comes back to one thing you've already touched on, Angela, in terms of should you include preliminary results in Part B1?
Well, again, if the preliminary result is something that helps you to explain, based on this preliminary result, I have this new question, or based on this preliminary result, there is this new research strategy I want to deploy because whatever, we reached a dead end and now I know, Eureka, how to get out of it, then you should summarize a little bit the initial results.
Okay.
I would say that's, again, connected with Part B1, again, being about the idea, and the objectives, Part B2 being about the implementation.
Alban, I come to you because I'm actually moving down one question because it changed order whilst I was reading it. There have been a lot of news stories in the US about new programs for those who wish to move to Europe. Can you tell us about, they say, the accuracy of these reports, but maybe you can tell us what the Scientific Council is thinking. They've already made some changes in terms of the startup funding. Maybe you can...
Yeah, so that is an element that we've described before, the inclusion of an additional €1 million for startup funding. That is very important, specifically targeted to researchers moving to the EU or an associated country from outside. Another one is, of course, the super grants that Angela has mentioned, that we have discussed already in detail, which are whose aim is to make Europe a more attractive site for carrying out the highest level research.
So it could be attracting people or retaining people in Europe in that respect.
Could be both.
And I think it's also worthwhile pointing out that we're actually probably one of the most open funding programs in that anybody is eligible of any nationality to apply. So you talked about US researchers, but Japanese researchers, Australian researchers, researchers from South Africa can apply to our grants in exactly the same way as a researcher from Ireland, from Germany or from Italy can apply. And coming into that, how important is the inclusion of international collaboration? Are they needed to make a strong application? Who would like to take this?
Again, I think it depends. I'm not an astrophysicist, but there are collaborations that are by design and definition quite international. You are a philosopher or a mathematician, and certain international collaboration can help moving the frontiers of science in a certain field, or they are not particularly, let's say, necessary.
Okay.
So it really depends on the field, I would say.
Okay. And the next question is about historical data on applications for starting grant. Thanks very much to my colleague Eilish, who's given you the data from the last call. Maybe turn to you, Alban, for the next question. Can an ERC starting grant by a theoretician include budget for an experiment implemented by an experimental collaborator? It's coming back to this collaboration question which Angela was talking about before.
Absolutely no reason that should be excluded. Anything that's in the interest of the project can be funded from the project funding.
Okay, and another question for you, very simple question in terms of what's the PhD age, a number of years after the PhD, for a consolidator grant in the current work programme?
It's 7 to 12 years.
7 to 12 years after
the
their PhD.
successful defense of the PhD.
Thank you. And then the next question, will specialists, remote reviewers, be engaged in the evaluation of step one on part 1?
No, remote reviewers are for the proposals that are, let's say, promoted to step 2. So, and as mentioned earlier, the panel members are identifying those specialists for each and all proposals that are promoted to step 2, with the idea of having not only the generalist, but still expert view, of course, on the proposal, with the contribution of these remote referees. Remote referees only stay remote, meaning they do not participate in the discussion, but their contribution is definitely considered in the discussion by the panel members, and sometimes are offering elements for the interview questions.
Okay. The next question requires us to do maths in our head, and I think that's not a good thing to do live. So the question is, I defended my PhD in October. It's just disappeared. October 20, I think it was 24. 18, am I eligible this year? I think one of the key things we should do, look at the work programme. It sets out really clearly the dates, exact dates, which means you're eligible for a particular grant in this year's call. So look at the work programmes.
And the question was referring to 2027, and there, of course, we'll have to wait a year to see the exact time frames. Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to answer one other question live, because we're coming towards the end of the webinar. We see there's still 137 to be answered. Don't worry, we will answer those in writing, but we have to limit the time of the webinar. So the last question, I think it's coming back to you again, Angela, similar to one we've been asked before. For an ERC grant, I know the PI is very important, but can I name and include funding for senior researchers from other universities?
Yes, if they are contributing to the research for specific reasons that are explained in the research plan, yes, this is absolutely possible. Again, if those senior researchers are named in a starting grant, one has to anyhow really make clear that the driving seat is by the starting grantee applicant, and the senior researchers have their task, their role, their expertise, which is contributed, but the driving seat is by the PI.
Very clear. Now, I'd like to thank you all for your enthusiasm in answering questions. We have come to the end of the time for answering questions. Please don't disconnect now. I have a few more things to say, but we will answer all of the questions which we haven't been able to answer live in writing, and those will be uploaded to our website. Give us a few days to answer them. They'll be done in due course. But I'd like to thank you for tuning into this webinar. We hope you found it useful. Before you go, there's one last question from us to you on Slido to give your feedback for this webinar and help us improve. So you'll be able to answer this question on Slido. It'll be available for a week following the end of this webinar. Don't forget to tune in for our second live webinar, which will give more advanced questions and details on the 2026 work programme, so it's targeted at those who are perhaps more familiar with ERC funding, perhaps those who are supporting researchers applying. That will take place on the 11th of September, and we'll announce more details of the timing and the details of that webinar, which unfortunately will not include Angela, as she will have left the agency by then. We'll announce those at the beginning of September. Now, many of you are new to ERC funding, and we're excited to announce the launch of a new set of ERC classes. Now, these are a series of short tutorials by video, which are designed to guide potential applicants through every step of the process. So you'll find videos on why you should consider applying, how to write your application, how the evaluation process works, and how to prepare for your interview to obtain an ERC grant. And we're also introducing 2 completely new videos. There was a question before on Synergy. One of these videos will cover Synergy, and there'll also be a video on how to write the ethics part of your proposal. We'll be releasing 1 new video every day starting today for the next week, so be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date. And now we can look at a short video about them together. So a short
Writing an
teaser of the
ERC
video.
application does take a lot of time and effort, and you may think you don't stand a chance. If you believe you have an ambitious research idea, an ERC application is really worth the effort. It will help you think more strategically about your research and the questions and the challenges that are most important to you. So let's see how to get you started.
I will focus on the two scientific parts and the administrative one, explain how each one is structured, and share some key questions to ask yourself before you start drafting your project.
In this video, I will walk you through the evaluation process. Knowing who will evaluate your proposal and how it will be evaluated at each step can help you tailor it to your audience. Hopefully, this will increase your chances of success.
ERC interviews have quite a reputation. They can be very exciting, but they can also be very stressful. Being evaluated by a panel of experts in your field, answering all sorts of questions for the possibility of getting a lot of money. Are you scared yet? Well, I guess everybody would be a little, but in this video, I will walk you through the whole process. This way, you will know a bit better what to expect and be and feel more prepared.
Synergy grants are meant for researchers willing to collaborate to address an ambitious research problem. Their duration is up to 6 years. Every synergy proposal must demonstrate that its objectives can only be achieved through the specific combination of knowledge and skills brought together by the participating PIs. And of course, you need a major scientific question of pressing significance.
So that gave you a flavour of the videos we'll be producing. They're all filmed with very talented staff in the agency who are best placed to guide you through the process of application and evaluation of our proposals. But of course, if you want to have other updates on our funding, please go to the ERC website. Follow us on our social media channels. We are on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and also on WhatsApp. And as I've mentioned before, please also contact your national contact points in your countries, and the link to the list of national contact points with their contacts you can obtain via our website. So before we leave for today, I'd like to say thank you to my fellow speakers, to Angela for her last webinar with us, and to Alban, thank you very much. I would also like to thank you all for tuning in, and I would like to thank my team who've been behind the scenes preparing this webinar. So I'd like to thank Hilda, Callie, Aris, Eilish, and Martin. And with that, I'd like to wish you a very good afternoon and goodbye from Brussels.
Bye-bye.